a Beachhead Advantage podcast, forging new markets. This podcast from Beachhead Advantage is a conversation addressing your obvious first questions. From Sydney, with your Australian Comprador CJ Warrick.
Well, typically their first port of call is they're trying to find someone to be a Australian resident director, statutory governance. Either the Australian resident director, or if they're actually fully across the situation, also the Australian public officer. Two separate roles, often performed by the same person. And so we come in with a statutory governance lean. We've often been recommended, referred by Trade Council or other clients or what have you, and their need is something that they require to operate a company here. It's not the same in every country, but Australia is one of several countries that requires you to have the director, or at least a director, resident in the country. So that's their opening gambit. Number two is often introduced by us as what else we can do for them. And so then that might kick off a line of discussion that creates a sort of a firmer bond of trust that we are not just there to be the silent, I am rarely silent, the silent director. And so if they kick off that question, that's great from our point of view, because it opens up the story about, whilst statutory governance is our raison d'etre, the rest of our services of the 6 pillars are how we can help them operate best in market. And getting them from just their first requirement to those other requirements, if they're going to do our job for us in that requirements gathering, that's great. Typically, we get to our other services later in the piece. The second question is often how fast, and that's a double-edged sword, because fast is often in the hands of authorities, whether that's ASIC or the ATO or the banks, that are beyond our control. But we endeavour to do it as swiftly as we possibly can. Lots of people have their various images of Australia. We punch above our weight in international lore, in international recognition. We're a nation of about 25 million people, and I mean, that's even smaller than Canada, where I'm from. And so, but the Australians, again, like the Canadians, are much loved because of their larrikin nature, because of all kinds of other things. And so the story of Australia is known to them before they ever possibly thought of coming here as a business. And so they have a different view of how we might operate than any knowledge they've gleaned before. And so our job, I guess, is to try and explain it to them how best they can land on our shores. Australia is not, in its essence, a difficult market to enter. I'd say we're possibly in, I've read reviews and surveys about this, we're possibly in the top 10. You have to do it right, and there are certain requirements that you can't get wrong, in which case you will end up in a whirlpool of administrative and statutory issues. But we're not a difficult country. There are all kinds of agencies here that are trying to encourage people to come and businesses to come to Australia. And I don't think the natural inclination is to reject companies coming here or to make it harder for them. Our natural inclination is to make it as easy as possible. That said, we do operate differently, and we have different laws, and we have things that are not necessarily uniquely Australian, but different than other countries like the United States or Canada or even Singapore or France or Italy or any of these countries. So we operate differently, and there is a sense, or not necessarily a fear of the unknown, but they are unsure of whether our Australian reputation is going to be fulfilled when they're trying to establish a beachhead foothold business here. It isn't that they can't do some of the things that we can do for them themselves. It is that because we do it over and over again, month in, month out, we know the pitfalls and we can point them in the right direction, on the right road. And so I would argue that whilst technically the country is welcoming and open for business, the finding the right partner to make sure that you do it right is as important as knowing that it's the market you want to enter. I've lived and worked in 4 countries. I haven't been in a country yet that there are as many rules that breach or break the corporate veil as here in Australia. There's 654 laws that breach what we would in other countries consider the protection of a limited company. And we are just used to that. I mean, a lot of them are in the HR area, a lot of them in the occupational health and safety, OH&S area. Some of them are in the finance area, and you breach them at your peril. And it is sometimes a salutary lesson to other people that when they suggest that they could get their sister or their cousin or their nanny to take on that role of director. It's a statutory regulation that the directors are responsible, I think, for more here in Australia, personally, than their associated colleagues who are directors of companies in countries in North America, in Europe, etc. And that sometimes is a surprise. In order to operate an entity down here, you have 2 requirements. You have to have an Australian resident director, and you have to have an Australian resident public officer. The first is for the statutory authority, the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, which is our company regulator, if you like. And the second, the public officer, is for the tax office, the Australian Tax Office, or the ATO. Most people know when they approach us that you need the first. Some people know, not many, that you need the second. And those roles can be fulfilled by 2 different people. Often they're fulfilled by the same. And they have different sets of rules and regulations that apply to them. And it would be a formidable task to try and explain all 654 of those to an incoming director or company. And so we believe that we take on those roles once we have confirmed and clarified and qualified the business. We believe we take on those roles with not only our confidence in the company, but that they have a security and a trust in our ability to fulfill those roles for them and not breach or not cause a breach of any of those fault lines that one might trip over. Ironically, the spiel is often the other end of the conversation. It is difficult to explain why it is not the usual sale, but I have to put it like this, that we do the due diligence in advance of them doing the due diligence on us. And that's because we have to make sure that we are able to accept a commission, accept an engagement. We have to make sure that the company has the simplicity of 3 things in place that make it acceptable for us to accept them into our client base. And finally, we want to see the whites of their eyes. We want to know that we're dealing with people of integrity. And so, ironically, our call is the other way around. Our first call is us getting them to tell us about them, not Beachhead telling them what we can do for them. And the reason for that is there's no point in doing the second half if the first half doesn't succeed. And you do it as subtly as you can, but the due diligence turned on its head makes it more comfortable for us then to move into sales mode and explain what we can do for them as a professional services provider. I think there's very few professions, and we call ourselves a professional services provider, though we're not accountants. We do a lot of accountancy-style work. We're not lawyers. We do a lot of paralegal-style work. But for those professions, they do not need to have the same kind of comfort that their client has all the required attributes for us to accept them. Lawyers and accountants do not carry the same responsibility and legal liability. So, yeah, I think it is unusual. The only other sector that you might consider where it is possible, where it's turned on its head, is in B2G or business to government type services, where you're sort of checking on the client's capability of entering into a discussion before you share your information about the types of services. But in our particular case, and we're not unique in the world, but the uniqueness, I guess, is that we need to be comfortable with our client before our client is comfortable with us. I should rephrase that. We should need to be comfortable with our prospect before our prospect determines that we are the right candidate to be their service provider. We have an efficient administration in the taxation office, but there are some anomalies of taxes that will be unusual to people from other countries in the world. The first, but I won't go on about it, that comes to my mind because it's my pet bête noire, is the fringe benefits tax. I'll revert back to that. But the one that most appropriately should concern anybody who's trying to start, especially online businesses exporting into Australia, is that we have recently changed our laws in the last few years to bring the minimum value of a product that attracts GST, our goods and services tax, down to $0. So previous to this, if you were importing in any size, over $1,000, typically you would be spending the taxes and import duties, as happens in other countries. But if you were a sole operator shipping in $25 worth of records, nobody buys records, CDs, DVDs, whatever. The tax office now requires the inbound importer to collect the GST on their behalf and remit it to the tax office. And so, I mean, if you're a very, very small player, under $75,000 Australian, then you can avoid that. But if you're in the small business enterprise and you're starting to put your foot into Australia, that's an imposition. And if you don't charge it and remit it, then ultimately, if you get found out, you're going to have to pay that 10% of whatever revenue you generated, because you're not going to be able to go back to the buyer and charge it. So that's unusual. We have a $0 threshold on that, largely driven by the Australian manufacturers, distributors, and retailers who were getting pipped at the post because Americans, Canadians, other countries could sell into this country online, and that's where the majority of this problem lay, without having to take on the burden of being that tax collector. There are other taxes. Fringe benefits tax, a ludicrous tax, a tax that drives me crazy. But it is a tax that is applied to the employer, not the employee, on benefits that the employee gets. So it is cart before horse. And, I mean, there were some wonderful ones. I mean, when I first came here, you were charged FBT if you had been given a car parking spot. You were charged FBT when airline miles first came in, if you got the benefit of airline miles or airline points as a result of taking a business trip. So I could rant on for hours about FBT. So there are some anomalies. But our tax at the small company level isn't that bad. It was 30. It's gradually going down to 25%. So we're not in the best decile of the world. But there are other countries that are worse. We have a fair, I would suggest, administration of the tax system. There are just some anomalies that you need to avoid. FBT on healthcare, when you are also encouraged to do healthcare because the employee will get a penalty if he doesn't have healthcare. So all kinds of strange ones. That said, if you skirt around them, I don't mean illegally skirt around them. I mean correctly make sure that you set up your compensation plans, correctly make sure that you set up your legal and financial structure, they will impinge less. But they do fill some of our days.
That was CJ Warrick, Beachhead Advantage, reducing time and cost for Australian growth. www.beachheadmgt.com